Hi again, everyone. Okay, so today is a different type of video. It's not one of my educational or mommy and me type videos. Today I want to focus on the reasons why we are learning Chinese in our house, why I'm learning it, why I'm teaching my daughter Chinese, or at least I'm showing her that I'm learning and hoping that it will inspire her to also become curious about this language learning journey that we are on. So yeah, again, this video is about that. Why it is important to learn Chinese in the 21st century. Like, I had a dream a couple nights ago and I just had characters floating in my brain, and I said, you know what, this is wild, but it also means that these characters are actually starting to solidify themselves in my brain, and there's a reason for this. So it prompted me to make this video, why it is important to learn Chinese in this day and age. So if you're interested in learning Chinese, please stay tuned so that you can understand maybe why it will be relevant to your life. And definitely like this video if you do, and share it, comment, subscribe if you're interested in some of the other content that we have going on. But with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so reason number one, the grammar. The grammar is not that bad, okay? If you have learned any of the Romance languages, Spanish, French, our English, okay, the grammar is atrocious. It's painful. I'm a native English speaker, and I still to this day learn grammar rules regarding my first language. So with Chinese, the grammar, there's no verb conjugation, there's no subject verb agreement, I am, you are. It's like the same verb across the board as far as every single tense that you are going to want to use to communicate. So that's awesome. Honestly, I love that about the Chinese language. Sure, there are some challenges when it comes to learning how to speak Chinese. And I'm referring specifically to Mandarin, okay? Because there's Chinese languages, Mandarin and Cantonese, and then there are variants of those as well. I'm focused on Mandarin. And there are 4 tones, well, 5 if you include the neutral tone. And that is definitely, it's a hurdle to jump over when you are learning how to speak Chinese. And then on top of that, there is the written structure of the language. So you have to learn a whole new form of writing, these pictograms or ideograms. I'm not sure if I said that correctly. Ideograms. So there are challenges, of course, when it comes to learning the Chinese language, but isn't it like that with any language? Practice makes perfect. Okay, so this brings me into my next point, why learn Chinese. And when you're learning through the language, of course, you are going to learn about the culture, perhaps some of the history of that language, and common phrases that are used to communicate, the same way that we do, like idioms and fun phrases where you can't take them like too literally, but you learn more about the people who speak this language. So that's really interesting. You really go on this kind of linguistic journey while you are learning, and you begin to analyze your own language or other languages that you have learned and how you communicate through those languages. For example, like my intonation, in English, of course, I might say what, or what, or, our intonation changes with the same words that we are using all the time. And when you do that in Chinese, you change the entire word. So you start to actually analyze your own language. And what else? Word choices. The words that you're using specifically to communicate your point. You'll start to think like, oh wow, English is I don't want to call it a dumbed down language because everyone speaks differently. But you look at the way that perhaps someone will communicate something in Chinese or in Spanish, and then how we communicate in English, and you're like, wow, I didn't think of trying to articulate it that way. So that's interesting. Plus, there's your style of speaking. All of these things you just start to study and analyze. You're like, oh my gosh, wow. The style of voice dragging, for example, or voice lagging, something that okay, so I had an interview recently, and my mentor told me, be careful with your voice lagging, okay? When you talk, you kind of let the ends of your words just kind of just drag. And I never thought about that before until he told me that. And you know what? I blame the Kardashians, okay? Let me give you an example. I feel like we might not have the best chemistry, but only time can tell. So we'll just have to see. That is voice dragging. And I was like, wait, I sound like that sometimes? Ew, I don't want to sound like that. And it just brings me back to, the Chinese language. When you are speaking, if you decide to speak like that, the way that we do in English, and drag your words in Chinese, you're changing the whole meaning of the word because of that whole tonal language aspect. Okay, that brings me to point number 3. You are going to have links to other languages. Yay! So cool, right? Just by learning the Chinese language, or at least becoming familiar with the sounds of the language and some of the words, and definitely the written structure, you're going to look at Japanese words and characters, and you're going to, that looks a little bit familiar to this one character that I know in Chinese. But really, it's not just one, there are several characters. And, the same goes for Korean. You are going to be able to recognize some Korean. And I believe it's 30% of Vietnamese is derived from the Chinese language as well. Don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. But you can do some research yourself. Just know that you will have links to certain Asian languages just by learning Chinese. Point number 4, the Chinese diaspora. Yes, Chinese are all over the globe, so you always will have an opportunity to practice your Chinese. Yes, keep in mind, there is Mandarin Chinese and there is Cantonese. So, obviously you don't want to offend someone by speaking one language and then they say, well, I don't speak that language at all. However, there are so many speakers of the Chinese language, these Chinese languages, that chances are you're going to go into a business, and if you break out a little bit of Chinese that you do know, even, the written structure, you write something down on paper to communicate like, hey, this is what I'm looking for, chances are you will be understood and you will be greeted with so much praise because, wow, you actually took the time to learn that language. Good for you. And that brings me to my next point, point number 5. China has fully integrated themselves into the world economy. Okay, Chinese is the language of business. Sure, English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, but Chinese is the language of business. Okay, let's look at some figures real quick. Okay, so let's have a look at this article here from thebalance.com where it says, for the 3rd year in a row, China was the world's largest economy in 2019, contributing to 17.3% of the world's GDP. Wow. Now we're going to skip down just a little bit more, and you see that the US was second, contributing to 15.8% share of the world's GDP. And that alone is astonishing because that this is the 3rd year in a row. And 2020 happened, it slowed down the Chinese economy, but it didn't stop them, okay? They're still moving. I'm not going to go too deep into that, and I'm not a financial person, so I don't want to dive deep on some topic that I'm not very familiar with. I recommend that you do your own research. However, I know that there are some people who give this information, this fact, pushback, because they want to believe that the US has the world's largest economy. But see, these experts who go and analyze all of these figures, they take into account PPP, or this purchasing power parity, which once it's adjusted, it eliminates differences in price levels between economies. So ultimately, China dominates the USA. It just is what it is. Not to mention, come on, people. Ever since we were children, almost everything that we've looked at in our lives, almost everything says made in China. You can't deny that fact. So, the United States may dominate in other areas and have a huge amount of spending power in the country, but China's making most of those products. Let's look at some more information, because I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to actually look at what the research out there says. And I'm not trying to change the trajectory of this video. I'm just trying to let you know the importance that lies behind learning Chinese. So this article from the New Yorker, right? You see here, it says, yet America is also dependent on China for basic commodities, including roughly half of its medical supplies. China is the U.S.'s second large source of car parts, surpassing Canada and tripling in value since 2007. Many are made in Wuhan, nicknamed the Motor City of China and the initial center of the pandemic. If China stopped exporting parts, it could close down multiple U.S. plants. In 2017, China provided 60% of all imported electronics, including cell phones, to the American market. China even provides a significant share of bicycles sold in the United States. China is also a valuable market for American goods. China has provided the greatest contribution to the global growth of fast-growing destinations for U.S. exports for 15 years until the Trump administration. Okay? You can go ahead and have a look at this article in its entirety on your own time. I highly recommend that you do if you're not familiar with the reach of China worldwide, and also, what has occurred since Trump took office between the United States and China. See, now I have firsthand experience having lived abroad in China for 6 years. I look at a lot of things that are happening today in 2020, and I feel like I've already experienced it before because China is that far ahead of the rest of the world. As far as digitization, that was hard to say, digitization and all of this online shopping experiences that people are kind of like giving some pushback to, but they're like weirdly accepting it because of the convenience. Yeah, that already existed in my life for the last 6 years. It's just the norm. But on top of everything, they are so advanced technologically that they make us look like the ancient ones. Meanwhile, a lot of people, when I tell them, I lived in China, they're just like, oh, wow, what was that like? Countryside, a lot of people wearing like those straw hats. How was that for you? And I'm like, I feel like I've stepped into, the past, by returning to the United States, actually. It's just amazing. It blows my mind. People have this like ancient dynasty ridden mentality as it relates to China, when in fact China is far advanced than the Western world. It's just fact. And I lived in a city called Shenzhen, which is the innovative hub of China. So I saw things that are coming out this year in the United States that came out in China 4 years. For example, let's take a look real quick, promise, at this article here from thediplomat.com. And you see here it cites Shenzhen as being regarded as China's reform landmark for 40 years and is now deemed as one of the world's largest leading innovation hubs. Its rise is a case study for China's continued economic boom. And they're not just a case study for China, they're a case study for the world. So keep that in mind. Okay, so I think I got lost somewhere with my numbers, but that was 5, 6, 7. 5 being China's integration into the world economy, bringing them all the way up to the top, and then 6 being how heavily reliant the United States is on their imports, and then 7 is just how advanced they are technologically, how we can actually look at what they're doing, take notes, and learn from it, or integrate it back perhaps. Now, point number 8, and this is my last point, is Africa. Now, we should see what is happening over in Africa. So China is Africa's largest trading partner and major source of investment. China looks at Africa and they want their oil, they need their oil, and they also look at Africa, the continent, and they're like, well, that's a huge market, okay? Especially because the population is so young. I believe over 40%, maybe even higher, of the African population is younger than 30 years old. So that's extremely attractive to China. In addition, they get resources. Now, there are some people, several people, who give major pushback to this partnership as if, well, are the Africans being taken advantage of? With this partnership, like what are they getting in return in order to help them build themselves up? Now, however you look at that is up to you entirely. I'm not going to talk too deeply about that. I'm just going to highlight this fact. It is what it is, at least for now. How are we going to make it work for us. That's how I'm thinking about it at this point. Like, how can you look at all of these figures, look at this major superpower worldwide and heavy on the African continent, heavy, and what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to sit there and just like complain? Or are you going to say, you know what? Let's work together. But also, I'm going to make this work for me. So once we all just accept the fact that there is no getting around this superpower, at least on our Earth, unless you can make up a whole new Earth and establish your own powerful reign, there's no getting around it. You just have to learn to make it work for you. That's why I say it's important to learn Chinese. In addition to all of those other fascinating reasons, you are going to work on your own self-improvement. You are going to learn a lot about your own language. You're going to learn a lot about yourself and how you communicate. And on top of that, you get to integrate yourself into a world, a language that is going to actually help you level up. So learn Chinese.